Very warm welcome to this session on evaluating national action plans to end violence against children. I hope you can hear me okay. I've heard my sound or my connection's a bit wobbly, so I hope I'm coming through okay. My name's Bess Herbert and I work at End Violence, leading advocacy on corporal punishment and also supporting European pathfinding countries. I'm also here with my colleague Cassia. And this is the last of 8 sessions in the Learning Exchange series. In previous sessions, we've covered the End Violence Knowledge Platform. We've talked about a methods menu, explored costing and localising a national action plan and child participation. And today's session is about evaluation, which of course is an essential element to build in from the start because it allows us to assess how well the plan is working, to make changes and course corrections, as well as giving us the evidence to talk about success and the importance of the work to end violence against children. So in just a minute or two, Lucia Soletti and David Cowney will make a 30-minute presentation about their work on evaluation of the Cambodian National Action Plan. Cambodia has been a pathfinding country since 2019 and has been implementing an action plan to end violence against children since 2017. And UNICEF, together with other partners and NGOs, has been supporting the government of Cambodia in the implementation of the action plan. In late 2020, UNICEF supported the Royal Government of Cambodia to conduct a country-led evaluation of the action plan. And to do this, they contracted Latanzio, a consultancy company based in Italy, specialising in design, managing and implementing evaluations of international development cooperation and public policies. Lucia Soletti is UNICEF Chief of Child Protection in Cambodia, and Dr. David Cowney is the lead evaluation consultant of Latanzio. And they will share their experience on conducting the evaluation, as well as introducing some of their colleagues. After their presentation, we'll hear briefly about evaluation in the Mexican context, and finally there'll be time for questions and discussion. If you have questions or comments as we go along, please do put them in the chat to get the discussion going, and I'll try to pick up on the questions at the end. And then finally, just to remind everyone, this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the End Violence website and widely circulated. So I don't know if you have started the recording, Cassia, but we should probably do that. And without any further waiting, let me hand over to you, Lucia and David.
Thank you, Bess. So I'm gonna, and of course, hi to everybody who is joining us today. I'm gonna share the slides. And just to confirm that this presentation will be done jointly by me as well as David Cowney, who was the lead consultant that we worked with on this specific evaluation. So I'm very pleased to share with all of you today the experience of Cambodia of evaluating the Violence Against Children Action Plan. And just to give you a little bit of a background information, Cambodia was actually the first country in Asia Pacific region to conduct a national survey on violence against children in 2013. And then based on that data, the government took the decision to move ahead in developing a violence against children action plan, which was launched in late 2017. And it was really developed based on a national theory of change, as well as the INSPIRE principles and strategies. Of course, from the very start, there was a plan to, as part of the action plan, there was an indication that an evaluation was needed. It was actually planned to be a midterm evaluation and ended up being a little bit later than the midterm. But finally, in in late 2020, as Bess was saying, the steering committee of the VAC action plan here in Cambodia, which is chaired by the Ministry of Social Affairs and is also composed by 12 other ministries, as well as UNICEF and NGOs, took the decision to move ahead in conducting this evaluation. And of course, what was important is that this process was really led by the country. So it was a country-led evaluation led by the steering committee who mobilized all the key stakeholders who support the process. And UNICEF, we have been providing financial and technical support, including with the evaluation expert within our team as well. But also facilitated the engagement of all other stakeholders and NGOs, also to broaden the scope of the geographical coverage beyond, and making sure that it was really representative of the all country efforts. And just to clarify, in terms of undertaking the evaluation, the purpose of the evaluation was, of course, to understand and measure the extent to which the Violence Against Children Action Plan has been implemented and how well it has been implemented to tackle violence against children here in Cambodia, and also inform and support the evidence-based decision-making process on the development of a new action plan, of course, which will be implemented afterwards, after this first phase. And in terms of the methodology used, these were already also defined specifically in the terms of reference. We, of course, planned to have a review of the relevant documents as well as field visits in specific sites prioritized for the Violence Against Children Action Plan. Of course, interviews and documentation of key program interventions that were part of the Violence Against Children Action Plan, as well as key informant interviews and focus group discussion, and regular engagement with the evaluation management team, the reference group that have been established, as well as all key stakeholders, the government, civil society, UN, donors, and even youth groups, of course. So I'm going to hand over to David to continue for the next couple of slides.
Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and greetings from the Western Caribbean. My name is David. I've been working as an evaluator since the 1980s. This project started, oh my goodness, about 9 months ago. And I've been working closely with the Latanzio and UNICEF teams on its implementation. We tried to distill down from a very complex set of activities to just a few core points about this. One is that when we started, we did a mapping of the evaluation environment to try to really make sure that we understood what this thing looked like and what it was that we were trying to evaluate. So we established the context of the evaluation, the nature of how it was implemented, the different actors involved, and also how it was being implemented by government and by development partners, international NGOs, and civil society. The intent of the evaluation, the intent of the program, we also mapped, and we looked at what that meant for the evaluation. It had innovative and experimental elements. There was some interesting provincial level programming that was tucked into this, but there were also core developmental objectives that international agencies and governments are dealing with around strengthening of delivery systems and trying to make sure that those systems are efficient and functioning. So we had to look at those different components, and that highlighted some of the issues around all the different parts that were involved in this action plan implementation. The focus was always a tricky one because we had to look at the action plan as an overall action plan, but we also had to understand what was going on within different programs that would show us what the innovations were, and also what success and blockages at program level meant for the overall action plan, because obviously things don't move all together. What did that do for the overall action plan, and what did that mean for the management of the action plan? And the issue of balance in the program, we were trying to understand the process during design about how they tried to both focus on system strengthening, primary prevention, response, policy and regulatory environment, learning and sharing, knowledge management. But really how they were also then trying to establish ways in which they could move forward in different areas based on opportunity. And we had to really understand what those different drivers were from the very beginning. The issue of being country-led is quite specific in terms of how evaluation was managed and who was involved. And of course, this had both summative and formative components. Like any really good evaluation, you want to know not just what happened, but what it means for the next thing that does need to happen. And there was quite an extensive array of engagement with a wide range of actors and the direct participation of children and the participation of other stakeholders and rights holders. Next slide. So in looking at the what guided this in terms of the context, we had to make sure that we set the evaluation at plan level, because we kept almost reverting to looking at what programs we're doing rather than understanding this broader context, because it's kind of a natural thing and it's something that people involved in programs are moving you towards. But we had to keep coming back to what is going on at plan level and where do programs fit in, rather than what are all the programs doing to construct a plan. And it sounds straightforward, it's not. It was actually quite a chore to remember to keep coming back to this. The old saying, this has lots of moving parts, is true here. It had a lot of different things going on, but because of the clarity in the action plan and what it was intended to do, we could keep our eye on the ball. We could keep a focus on the end goal. And we also had a situation where the plan was well thought through in terms of national and international environment. It looked at alignment, it thought that through, and it allowed us then to reflect on whether alignment was taking place. I think one of the things that comes out of most evaluations, but was especially true here, is that the process was extremely important in what happened and what the political buy-in was and how the program basically built a constituency around it. The process was extremely careful here. There was a lot of attention to process issues. So we really had to understand what those things were and what it meant for the success or otherwise of the action plan. The intent, and this was the issue of trying to make sure that we continue to focus on outcomes, but also outcomes that last. And you've got outcomes that are very high order. You've got things around dramatic reduction in levels of violence. And these are things that are ingrained in all of our societies. They take time to change. They're difficult things to do. And so you have to look at how the conversation is changing. You have to understand how the kind of outcome intentions start to manifest. This is only, remember, the first 5-year plan, so you had to start to try to understand where this thing might be going. There were also some innovative components. There was a fascinating one on child marriage, where one of the remote provinces really got tucked in behind it and made a lot of things work quite well. It did show how that kind of mixture of political commitment and support from national government and from development partners could make a sustained difference fairly quickly. There was a process of continuing learning, and there was a mixed bag of documentation of that learning, but between that and the direct interviews, we were able to try and understand really what we could learn from these different initiatives. There was a clear intention of visibility and building political support throughout. The Prime Minister's office was engaged at the beginning, but we all know that you can lose that attention. You need to continue to work on how to make that that continue to happen. And I think there was the country-led nature of the evaluation followed a country-led process implementation of the action plan, and it showed that there were ownership issues around this that could have gotten lost in implementation, that didn't get lost in implementation because of the way in which implementation occurred. Because this was a focus of implementation, you could see that as an evaluator, that this was going on. And it's a valuable thing related to sustainability, local financing, capacity building, and all the rest. Related to that, you could see how they tucked this set of activities into child protection more generally, and how they were sometimes using this as a bridgehead to advance things, but other times they were tucking it in where other advances had been made. So there was a lot of strategic thinking going on that we had to understand and look for and found. Obviously, not everything works, but by and large, it did. The process focus on achievement of objectives was always clearly there, and it's something, again, that can get lost during implementation. You think you're keeping an eye on the ball, but in fact, you're looking at something right in front of you. There was that kind of longer-term vision of what's going on and striving towards outcomes. One of the factors that stood out was the coherence in delivery. And you've got so many different actors, so many different agendas, and yet there was a continued attention to trying to make sure that these moving parts were moving together. It doesn't necessarily mean they did. It meant that there was a considered effort to make sure that they did so. And this underlined the levels of complexity in the exercise, but it also underlined the fact that there was attention to dealing with that complexity. This was not an easy thing to do, and yet through that there was a continued focus on trying to make sure that the action plan was implemented in a coherent manner, and that the objectives and intended outcomes were ever present. And thinking about a country-led process, that is not an easy thing to do. You can get caught up in implementation. The issue of balance is always a tricky one, because you can invest $1 in primary prevention and get $10 back. You can invest $1 in response to violence and get 50 cents back, but you still have to deal with response. It's a tricky thing to do. There were remarkable situations where, and this was something that came up in the evaluation, where, of course, local definitions of violence varied from international definitions. And therefore, there were a lot of cases where people said, no, violence has disappeared here, when you knew the violence was still there. So dealing with who makes it into response was something that the implementing partners had to contend with. They had to understand how to create demand for response services. And trying to get that right and trying to get the financing of that right is a very, very tricky thing. But by and large, the fact that they kept their eye on that ball, we thought was quite important. I mentioned country-led, and it really is. It's important in how you implement the program, the action plan itself, and how you implement the evaluation. That matters. The approach, again, was quite expansive, but we realized that we had to really get underneath the implementation environment to try to understand the actors and their motivations that were involved. Trying to do that from 8,000 kilometers away, this was a tricky thing to do. We had a very solid national team that really helped us do this. And I know that there's normally a sense that Cambodia is very much a homogeneous society, but there are parts of the nation that are quite distinct, and we had to make sure that we accommodated those differences as well as the homogeneity. So the approach to that was simply to make sure that we listened to enough people in enough different ways to try to get a sense of what the story was that underlined it. I think from my side, that's the presentation of those particular slides. I'm going to turn off my camera and let my colleague.
Yes, thank you, David. And just to continue on the presentation, we wanted also to emphasize, the efforts that have been made to really, looking at the governance and participation of the stakeholders in the whole process. Again, emphasizing the fact that it was a government-led process, and it was extremely important to have this government leadership, also for engaging other key stakeholders in their participation, as well as leading in the decisions, as well as the division of labor and resource mobilization. When we started working also on the development of the terms of reference, we have done this in full consultation with the Minister of Social Affairs that is leading the implementation of the action plan, as well as key other stakeholders and experts. And an evaluation management group have been also established, which was composed by UNICEF team, as well as the government, a member of the government technical expert, to again ensure the government leadership and ownership of the process. And it was this evaluation management group that has reviewed together the applications also when we were looking for the firm to conduct the evaluation here in Cambodia, and conducting, of course, the different technical and financial assessments. The participation of the key stakeholders and informants in the data collection, of course, was facilitated by this leadership by the government, and the government formally requesting, of course, also the participation of the different stakeholders in the data collection as well. And then another key element of this process has been the fact that we have established, or we actually made use of two different reference groups. The first one was actually a government existing technical working group of the Violence Against Children Action Plan, specifically focusing since the start of the action plan implementation on M&E. And the second reference group was actually newly established specifically for this evaluation, and it was mainly composed by donors and child protection experts, as well as, of course, also including from GP-EVAC, as well as the UNICEF experts, but also from civil society and so on. So really try to have a range of actors that could contribute in reviewing also the overall process of the evaluation. David, would you like to take over again on the challenges and means of mitigation that we have experienced?
Right, that was a short break, wasn't it? Okay, thank you for being so efficient. I've alluded to some of the challenges and means of mitigation, so let me jump into this. One of those is the issue of COVID-19. We have to acknowledge that this makes our lives more complicated. It makes evaluation harder. It's always good when you're in the field and you convene and you meet people. It makes a difference in how you do this. Fortunately, I've been to Cambodia on previous occasions, but it still made it difficult to do this. And the fact that we had a solid national team really made a difference. And of course, that's always a major challenge these days. The issue of complexity, as I say, we had to keep our eye on the ball, and that sounds easy, but there's all sorts of shiny objects that are waving in front of you, and you can really move in the wrong direction here. At the end of the day, I often ended up overanalyzing things and writing sections that were far too long and had to kind of come back to the basics. And Ambra, a colleague at Latanzio, the evaluation manager, kept coming back to me saying, okay, let's make sure we keep our eye on the ball. So that and weekly meetings with the team at 4 a.m. my time, weekly meetings with the team, meant that we kept our eye on the ball. There was really solid evaluation management in this, and they managed us as if they were managing the action plan itself, and that makes a big difference. We kept slipping into program level focus. I think that was also from the UN side and from our side. We kept getting diverted a little bit with that. And so we had to get that balance right. And in the end of the day, we did. There was also just simply sheer perseverance of trying to get through this. This was an enormous task. We had different actors, different needs and expectations. There was more than one reference group, and people from different agencies and different situations look at the same thing differently, and trying to then work out what that was and what that meant was a constant challenge. But the fact that there was such a considered engagement with the client every week at 4 a.m. meant that we could keep a focus on what that was. The theory of change was fascinating. It was really a solid theory of change, but it was way up here. And when you tried to operationalize it, you really discovered that while it was inclusive and really good for framing the development of the action plan, it was not an implementation tool. It was too high order. I had the same situation in Somalia, and what we did was we took that higher order theory of change and brought it down to operational components, broke those down into constituent elements, and used that to manage the program. But it is a real chore. But I have no doubt that with the next action plan, this team will be able to do that, especially now that they see that that's something that could be done. It made it a bit tricky to conduct a theory-driven evaluation, but the theory of change in terms of its operational side found its way into the results framework. And it found its way into the aims and objectives of the action plan itself. So we were able to use these as almost proxy measures of this broader issue. But I think they're very clear that next time they want to make sure that follows through. Yeah, the issue of focusing on what resulted, not what was done, that is always an issue. What was done only mattered in terms of what resulted. And we have to continue to remember that this is not a process evaluation. It is an evaluation of what happened and what it means for the next round. Now, here's one where I think this is a fascinating thing for evaluations more generally, and that's that the evaluation questions focused on higher level action plan issues quite well, but could have used a bit of a scrubbing from our side. And what I realized well into this is that when you as an evaluator receive the evaluation questions from the client, it's almost as if they're on a tablet rather than an electronic file. And you tend not to want to mess with it because you're saying they know what they were doing. So they kept telling us, please assess these questions, but we were always a bit timid in doing so. And that fundamentally is my fault. As a lead evaluator, I should have been more attentive to challenging the evaluation questions rather than simply saying, let's go with those. At the end of the day, we were able to respond to the evaluation questions in the way in which I think was the intent behind the question. And so that worked, but it really was my fault and our fault from the consultant side for not being a bit more assertive. It's simply not how we're trained. We're trained to take these questions as coming down on tablets rather than something that you can mess with. We were asked to look at emergent impacts, and this is something that we deal with as evaluators. Anybody that does evaluation can tell you, even an impact evaluation often doesn't look at impacts. The bottom line here is that we shouldn't have had to look at this. What we did was we tried to get people to speculate on impacts, and we had people all over the map. There was such little coherence in what came from this. Some people decided that violence disappeared, especially those that were engaged at local level who weren't seeing cases come through. And so they said, well, that's it. We've taken care of violence. In other cases, there were people that felt like nothing was going on and that the program had no impact. None of the programs had any impact. The action plan didn't succeed. And where there were others that nuanced it, it took me so much time to try to make sense of that Tower of Babel to figure out what the impacts might be. And the bottom line is we probably should not have been asking those questions this early. I think they do fit in the next action plan evaluation, but certainly not at this juncture. Next slide, please. Right, okay, so we're distilling down to the next one. Basically, expectations around program level came up. We all of us succeeded and kind of tapping that down, but it did keep coming up. And I think part of it was that there was an expectation amongst development partners that were providing finance to a particular program to say, what did this program do? In a way in which we should not have been asking, in a way in which we could not answer. And so there was always this dynamic of trying to make sure that we didn't get way out in front of our skis. And in a couple of cases, we got out in front, but it wasn't too bad because we understood that broader context. We'd asked enough people enough questions to know that we were on solid grounds when we stretched a little bit on a program statement. The divergent expectations, it's an issue of evaluation management and communications within the team. And it was a considered process of back and forth. And here again, I think the consultant being more assertive in saying, look, we've got two different things going on here from these two different processes. We just need to make sure that you understand why we think we should go in this direction. And at the end of the day, we got there, but it's something that we could have kept more out in front of us as we were proceeding with this. The issue of process and outputs kept coming up. This is wasn't just program level, it was a process of the action plan implementation. And we just needed to keep coming back to the broader issue of outcomes, not process and impacts and outputs. It was just something that we all tend towards and we needed to keep moving away from. Because if you've been banging your head against curriculum reform, you want to know. You want to tell us about curriculum reform, but in our side of it, we want to know what it meant because you did that. And it's hard to separate those two things out when you have been working 70 hours a week to get the bloody curriculum reformed. Theory of change, I already mentioned. The impacts I mentioned, the focus I mentioned. Again, that was my bad for not pushing on the veracity of the evaluation questions. At the end of the day, the evaluation questions were largely fine, and the ones that we had a little bit of difficulty with, we made work anyway, but it was my fault at the beginning for not simply asserting myself and saying, well, let's look at these things more clearly. I think it would have helped if we had a session reviewing the questions where we all could have assessed their utility. I think we're shifting now back to my colleague at UNICEF for lessons learned.
Yes, thank you, David. So in terms of lessons learned, we think that, so again, it has been really a very, interesting and but also complex process. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we did work on the TOR of this evaluation from the start with the government, but we think that in the end it would have been even better if the TOR could have been co-signed also by the government, so to really again ensure further their ownership of the overall process. And one thing that we found, I think that we did and we found extremely useful, was that we used the existing mechanism as well for the quality assurance of the evaluation. As I was mentioning, we did work with the technical working group number 3 on M&E, specifically assigned for the Violence Against Children Action Plan, and that has been an added value. We also recognize that we should have really, it's important in this type of process to capitalize on the country-led nature of the evaluation, but take that also as an opportunity to build the national capacity in evaluation on social programs and increase again their ownership and capacity in doing that. And we think that if we will do this, of course, again, it would be important to organize and joint sessions also at the beginning of the evaluation and throughout the process to explain the core stakeholders, the scope and exercise, and set clear boundaries as well, because this would help ensure clear expectations and understanding of what is being evaluated from, and all stakeholders can really better reconcile with the expectations. So really emphasizing a little bit more on using the opportunity of the evaluation to also building the capacity and making sure that everybody is at the same understanding from the start. And another aspect that is important to highlight as a lessons learned is the fact that I think we are always a little bit too ambitious in terms of, you know, the time frame and how much time the review process takes, especially when you are engaging with really a big group of stakeholders. I was referring at the beginning that the Violence Against Children Action Plan here in Cambodia is actually being implemented by 13 different ministries and then a multitude of NGOs and other partners. So it does take time to go through the review process of every single step. And then, of course, there is also the language aspect, which requires additional time in making sure that also those that, you know, that all the documentations is in the local language and everybody is fully, you know, understanding and endorsing, you know, the process and the results as well. So I would like just to finish by highlighting how we think the evaluating the action plan here in Cambodia has been useful, and clearly the evaluation has provided a number of very important recommendations at the strategic, operational, and programmatic level to improve the implementation of the current action plan, as well as give us guidance on how we shall proceed in the next phase of the action plan. And David already highlighted, but clearly it came out very strongly the fact that we do need to strengthen the M&E component, through building the results monitoring into all programs in the action plan monitoring systems. Really strengthening and emphasizing on the learning and documenting the learning and the reporting on the progress and regress. David also mentioned a key recommendation is really having a theory of change, which we had, and guided actually the development of the Violence Against Children Action Plan, was not only important for the design, but is actually, it should have been utilized also for the effective implementation and as a key critical tool for that. So this is another key recommendation that we should pay more attention also in moving forward in the next phase, to ensure that the theory of change is not only utilized in the design phase, but actually in the implementation phase as well, and help us with the M&E aspects, of course. And then there's been also a very important recommendation looking at the importance of setting up also an impact evaluation component for the next action plan, as well as establish means to further track the expenditures and determine the unit costs, which I believe it's probably very similar in other countries. It's always difficult also to look at the financial contribution of the action plan and keeping monitoring as well how the investments have been contributing to the implementation, and track really the expenditures and the investment on the implementation of the action plan. And then finally also to what would we see as a key way forward is to devote, of course, additional attention to the engagement of the right holders and integrate response to the Violence Against Children Action Plan. It has been done already in the current phase of the action plan, but of course more work, there could be room for improvement in this area. So I would like just to finish by recognizing again and acknowledging this has been really a big effort and a joint effort. Here we are just listing somehow the core team, but from Latancio and UNICEF, but actually there's been a lot of course, as I said, really government driven. There's been a lot of of efforts and the support from government and civil society counterparts. So we could not put everybody there in our last slide, but just to recognizing and acknowledging that this has been really a very big participatory process, and it's been really useful as a learning process for Cambodia to improve the implementation of the current action plan, as well as guiding the next phase beyond the current time frame of the action plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucia and David. That was fascinating. Such a kind of incredibly deep piece of work. And I don't know about everyone else, but the points I took away were about the importance of the country-led approach, the importance of political commitment and kind of building that capacity as you go. And then the other point I really heard was about evaluating the plan rather than the programs, and what a challenge that is. But yes, so much to take away. So we are going to hear 5 minutes from Sarah Antillon Esparza, and she will now talk a little bit about evaluation in the Mexican context, so we can have a contrast. So yeah, I might need to ask you to stop sharing your slides. And I believe, thank you. I think Sarah has participated in the evaluation of the previous National Action Plan in Mexico and the development of the next one, working both for the government and now at UNICEF. Please correct me if I've got any of that wrong, Sarah. And yeah, it would just be great to get a flavour of your experience in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and hi, everybody. I think all Pathfinders countries share the challenges that Lucia and David present. I think they are the same for everyone. So I just want to share with you some of the lessons we learned in Mexico with the 2 national action plans. One of them are currently implementing, and about the evaluation. Mexico was one of the first countries to become a Pathfinder in 2016. So we established a commission to discuss, to approve, and to implement the National Action Plan. So this was really important because, as David and Lucia present, this was really helpful to evaluate how it was implementing the action plan. The first challenge that we encountered was to define indicators that will allow us to measure progress, because this was a really short action plan. This was a 2 years action plan, so you can imagine how challenging it was, because it was really a short period of implementation, and we were facing this huge problem of violence against children. I mean, we have high rates of sexual violence, corporal punishment, disappearance, femicide, and homicide. So you have this great action plan, but you have a huge problem of violence. So you need to find a balance that what you really can achieve. So the first national action plan was really ambitious. We have 31 actions in the action plan, and it was mainly implemented by the federal government. So this is one of the first challenges, or the first complexity of the plan. You have a federal government that can implement different actions, but you also have states that need to implement also different kind of activities. So we had to decide which level we was going to act mainly. So as this was a federal commitment, we work at the federal level. So this was really, really complex. And also there were so many actors involved in these action plans, because we have these 31 actions, and we need a really high amount of time to monitor and to evaluate what these actions were implemented, what was implementation of these actions. And so we decided that the plan was not going to include indicators of impact, because this is really complex and we didn't have time, because the federal government was going to end at the 2018. So at the end of the period, the Secretariat of the Commission that I talked to you prepared a really simple reporting mechanism. So each authority who was responsible for reported progress can give us some of the information, and that was how we elaborate the result report. So some of the conclusion and maybe some of the lessons that we learned in these two action plans was that first, it is important to discuss in the design stage of the action plan the indicators that you are going to use. It can be really challenging and maybe a temptation to use some indicators that can be, like David said, to end violence in our country, but that is not real. So you need to identify and discuss indicators that can be real for the time that you are going to implement the plan. So you also need to set a monitoring and evaluation mechanism from the beginning, because everyone needs to understand and to agree which mechanism you are going to use. For us, it was easier because we had this commission, but you need to be really clear what is going to be the mechanism you are going to use. And also we have focal point for each actor involved in the implementation, so that was really good for us. But as always, the shorter focal points you have is better, because you can manage better the information they give you. Also, I just want to share that many agencies, because it was mainly a government lead, for many agencies, the reporting process became very, very a heavy workload, because our focal points have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of reports to give in the regular basis. So this became really, really, really heavy workload, and sometimes we didn't have information when we need it. So it's something you need to be aware of that. And for the second action plan, the reporting is trying to avoid duplicating information requests. And also it was a challenge to include NGOs in the evaluation, because you have this huge problem of violence, and sometimes the evaluation do not reflect that you are ending that violence. So it's important to discuss from the beginning how the NGOs are going to be involved, especially if this is a government-led process. And you need to consider that evaluation takes time. So if you have a specific period of implementation, you need to maybe think that the evaluation can take maybe 1, 2, or 3 months. So you need to be aware of that. And for federal countries, that as I say, the biggest challenge is that the progress can be reported at the federal level, but that's not necessarily the progress at the state level. So you need to balance how the actions are implemented and how you evaluate it. So I think I don't want to take more time, but I think that's the main lessons we learned in Mexico.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You've packed so much helpful information into a few minutes. And thank you also for joining at this hour of the day for you. I think it's very early for you. Yeah, I think the complexity of the task really comes through from what you're talking about. So we have just a few more minutes. This is an opportunity to ask any questions that you have. If you'd like to turn your camera on, you'd be very welcome to do that, but don't feel that you have to. But if there's so much to discuss about this effort to effectively evaluate. Have you got questions about any of the details of what our speakers have been talking about? I'll give you a minute. Yes, I can see. I think is that AB, Amanda.
Sure. Thanks, Bess. For everyone on the call, my name's Amanda Bride, and I'm the Global Child Protection Advocacy and Policy Lead for Save the Children. Thank you for the excellent presentations. It was so informative and really, really helpful. I had a quick question for David. You mentioned about when the questions on asking impact to the stakeholders, that it was asking them maybe a little bit too early, getting back competing answers about there was lots of impact, there was no impact, but you also said that it needed to focus on that impact and outcome, and I assumed that the type and level of questions are thinking about what's the early manifestation of what you want to see, but just kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about kind of the level of questions so we're not coming up against those challenges in our evaluations. Thanks. Hopefully that makes sense.
Should I go ahead and respond, or are we waiting for multiple questions?
I would say go ahead. Yeah, if you can go ahead on that one.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you. The fact is that because I design field instruments for a living, I over-designed the field instrument for this one. So I was coming at impact from 30 different points of view. And what we did was we wrote the full field instruments, and then we segmented that to ask different audiences. And the whole idea was trying to quadrangulate responses just to make sure that we were getting clarity across those different groups. And no matter how specific we tried to be, it was difficult for people to answer questions about early manifestations of impact. So in essence, what we were getting was perceptions within programs, for example, of results. And that is what I anchored a lot of the writing on, because the result is something that's tangible. But if you're talking to a group of opinion leaders in a community, you're no longer dealing with program results, you're dealing with speculation. And we therefore tried different questions in a different way, and it simply didn't work as well. Even though we nuanced it, again, I think the key informant interview instrument was 23 pages long, so we obviously had to divide that amongst different actors. I honestly think that if we would have moved away from impacts and focused results in terms of actual implementers, then we could have made much more progress on that. Impacts, however, by year 8, the next action plan comes through, there will probably be manifestation of impact. There's a lot of community strengthening going on in terms of the infrastructure around child protection. This will start to make more sense then. For now, it's too early. I hope that answered the question. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, David. I can see another question from Milene Kidane. Would you like to go ahead?
Hi, Bess. Yes, thank you. Let me see if I can turn on my camera, although it is late. Yeah, so colleagues, sorry, I did arrive a little late to the meeting, but I wanted to pick up on something that our colleague from Mexico said about both the scope of what's all included and how they try to prioritize in a cohesive way such a huge and massive problem that we all face. Mexico must face a lot, but there isn't a country that isn't facing all of these issues. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, and it could be open to anybody. How do we help prioritize among all the priorities to make sure that we have something that we can actually measure and be held and hold government to account for achieving? Because some of these documents that we spend so much time helping produce and so on just become these sort of documents that we refer to. It looks good, it sounds nice to have a national strategy, a national plan, all of these things. And then when it comes to implementation, we're a little bit challenged and certainly evaluating how impactful it was. So, and then the other thing that I thought was really interesting, although a bit challenging for me, is the 2-year nature of the first plan, because I don't know how much we can achieve with all of this. So maybe over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. We have just a couple of minutes, so maybe Sarah, if you'd like to respond quickly, and then maybe Lucia and David, see if you want to make any further comments.
Yes, maybe about how you prioritize. I think that for the second action plan, we decide to identify what the federal government decided was their main actions they were going to take, because there was the investment that we was going to have for the rest of the period. So maybe it was not the best priority, I don't know, but it was more a political decision that we should identify what government was identified as their priority, and then we need to reinforce that, because the agencies and all the, as I say, all the money was there. So it was something that maybe the action plan could be better if it was in the same mood of the government. So that was, we decided for the second one, but it was a huge challenge. And from the NGOs, as I said, this was also the main critic about that the action plan was not working.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Lucia, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, no, I think Milena asked a very good question that I think we are all struggling with. You know, how do we help prioritizing within, you know, the key approaches and interventions also, because as I mentioned, also the Cambodia Violence Against Children Action Plan, it was actually guided by the INSPIRE framework, right? Which is again a set of key strategies that, because we all know that to address violence against children, of course, you do need to intervene at different levels and with different strategies. So I think we in Cambodia here, there has been definitely efforts to look at what to prioritize within, as I said, still the overall INSPIRE framework. And I think the government did decide to prioritize a certain key intervention, such as the positive parenting program or positive discipline in schools, as well as behavioral change campaign. So these were some of the key interventions that have been actually prioritized for the implementation here in Cambodia. But of course, keeping everything else, like, you know, related to the case management process, building the social service workforce, having, you know, so it hasn't been, you know, I don't think I have the perfect answer for Milan, but I do think that the approach Cambodia has been taking, I think it has been quite reasonable in trying to still prioritize certain key interventions. And as part of the overall process of child protection system strengthening, but clearly also, as we were saying before, we also need to be realistic about how can we measure, you know, the results of this intervention in such a short time. I mentioned at the beginning that the implementation of this action plan started in late 2017. So we are just basically 4 years, or not even 4 years of implementation. And of course, it does take time to have, you know, all these up and running, and also let's not talk about scale, right? And recognizing that although it is a national action plan, there are, of course, it's not fully, you know, implemented at all levels countrywide. So yes. I think we do need to make decisions on prioritization and discuss with the government and see what the best to prioritize, and be realistic also in our expectations as well.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Really, really helpful comments. And unfortunately, we are out of time. It does sound like we could discuss this for a lot longer, because I think the detail of this work is incredible. But we will be sharing the recording, we'll be sharing the presentation with everybody, and maybe we can find another way to continue this discussion. Yeah, thank you so much for taking part, and we look forward to being in contact again soon, and particularly thank you to the presenters. Yeah, really, really interesting session. Thanks. Have a good day, everybody.